We start, yeah. Good morning to everybody, and also good evening to the people from eastern part of India, from eastern part and Asian part. Very warm welcome to all of you to the one-day Council for Research in Value and Philosophy online seminar on philosophizing across boundaries. And we are grateful to each one of you for joining at different and for different difficult time zones. I extend a very special welcome to all our speakers, including the two who are going to give their opening remarks, and Dr. Hu Yaping, the main inspiration behind organizing the seminar on a very important theme at the critical juncture of globalized philosophical world. We have two extremely distinguished scholars for opening remarks. First, from Professor Luca M. Scarantino, President, International Federation of Philosophical Societies, called FISP. And second, by Professor William A. Barbieri, on behalf of the Council for Research in Values and Philosophy, Catholic University of America, McLean Center for Study for Culture and Values. Few words about managing the limited time we have. We will have opening remarks from each for about 15 minutes, and each speaker would present for about 15 minutes, followed by 10 minutes discussion. I hope this is acceptable to everyone. Before I invite Professor Luca Scarantino and Professor Barbieri for opening remarks, I will just share a few words to introduce both of them, though they need no introduction to most of our audience. Professor Luca Maria Scarantino is currently President of International Federation of Philosophical Societies, to be held in Rome in 2024, President of the 25th World Congress of Philosophy. He has extensively published. Just give me a minute to adjust my screen. Yeah, is that okay? Is my screen okay?
Yes.
Yeah, okay.
Yes, it is.
Yeah. He has extensively published on contemporary Italian philosophy. His current research interests include the definition of cross-cultural moral patterns, focusing on basic interpersonal features such as persuasion, violence, trust, resentment, generosity, and love. He is the general editor of the international journal Diogenes. He was Secretary General of FISP from 2008 to 2018. Along with his opening remarks, I would also request him to say a few words about the thematic description of the 25th World Congress of Philosophy. In fact, Dr. Karim, who is our last speaker today, asked about the theme description from the FISP, but there's no thematic description at the FISP website. So I would request Professor Luca to please give a little description of the theme. Our second opening remark professor is Professor William Barbieri, who is the director of the McLean Center for the Study of Culture and Values and committee chair of the Council for Research in Values and Philosophy at the Catholic University of America. He teaches in the religion and culture and moral theology ethics programs in the School of Theology and Religious Studies and directs the Peace and Justice Studies program. His publications include Ethics of Citizenship, Immigration and Group Rights in Germany, Constitutive Justice, From Just War to Modern Peace Ethics, and At the Times of the Secular, Reflections on Faith and Public Life. He has also published articles in the areas of human rights, comparative ethics, peace studies, Catholic social teaching, and German studies. He also has been a faculty at Hebrew University of Jerusalem and joined Catholic University of America as faculty in 1994. With these few words, I would request Professor Luca Sacramento to kindly give his opening remarks. Professor, the floor is yours.
Thank you, dear Professor Mukherjee. Good morning or good evening to everybody. Good afternoon for some of us. I just say a few words, much less than 15 minutes. The first kind of mandatory word, which is also a very meaningful one for me, is to tell you that how privileged I feel to be here with you at the RVP Center again. It's a privilege and it's a pleasure. And I really admire more and more the extraordinary scholarly quality that the RVP Center is able to bring together in these online conferences. And I hope there will be an opportunity soon to meet in person again in Washington, DC, or anywhere else. You're gathering a real international network. You bring it together each time, and it's admirable. So I would like to congratulate and thank Dr. Hu Yeping for making this possible, and Professor William Barbieri for making it possible as well from the headquarters of the RVP in Washington. RVP has traditionally drawn a significant part of its activities in connection with World Congresses. This is a very fortunate attitude, I believe, and I'm certainly happy to see that it continues. And today's workshop is yet another example of this policy. Philosophy across boundaries is, as you probably know, the theme of the next World Congress. And to answer the request by Professor Mukherjee, the content and the description is supposed to come out in the website of the Congress, which is being prepared by our colleagues in Rome. I understand they are a bit late on the schedule they had provided, but it should be out soon enough. The website of FISP does not include the information that should be on the website because we did not want to have it out before the website comes out, but we might consider putting on the website of FISP within the next weeks if the circular and the website are not ready by then. But the main theme, as you know, is philosophy cross boundaries, and it will be held in Rome in the first week of August 2024. Now, I should add that this title, Philosophy Cross Boundaries, actually reflects an extremely timely concern, even beyond the original intention of the steering committee of FISP. We claim no merit in this. We chose the theme 3 years ago. At that time, our initial purpose in choosing philosophy cross boundary was to mark a continuity with the previous Congress held in Beijing in 2018. The theme, philosophy cross boundaries, was chosen in relation to cross-cultural or the intercultural vocation of philosophy. In our intention, it would build on the debates and the exchanges that took place in Beijing, and it would focus on a fundamental idea, the idea that since contemporary cultures are produced in a plurality of places all across the planet, and they merge, exchange, and endlessly relate to each other, then philosophy, as a theory of cultural forms, should be able to engage in and with the same large plurality of cultural traditions. We no longer write for a particular audience, no matter where we are. On the contrary, we are in growing need to address a plurality of audience in different traditions, areas of the world, cultures. We need, therefore, to find new ways to perform a philosophy. And this implies that we overcome some of the existing boundaries of philosophy itself. Hence, the idea that was at the core of the Beijing Congress and that we expect to be very much at the core of the Congress in Rome, the idea that we are called to reassess the sense of philosophy, the scope of philosophy itself, to enhance the theoretical diversity of philosophical concepts, and to proceed to a very delicate, yet inevitable reappraisal of the nature and the scope of philosophy and its relations with other forms of spirituality, of science, and of religion. So as we claimed in Beijing, we are called to rethink in widely comprehensible ways the notion of being or becoming human. It was clear to us at FISP that this process does not require that we destroy boundaries. On the contrary, it does necessitate that we conceive philosophy as a way of bringing different approaches together, that we help them interact, merge, modify each other, and by so doing, we rebuild a broader and more inclusive set of philosophical concepts and ideas. An analogy was occasionally used to compare philosophical boundaries to languages, which are distinct, yet tend to merge, to evolve, and eventually to disappear, leaving the place to newly formed and possible more fitted languages. Since FISP chose the theme of the Congress in this spirit, that was over 3 years ago, many things have obviously changed and are still changing in the world. While interculturality still plays, in my view, a driving role in the current evolution of philosophy, other drives have become increasingly apparent. Transformations in the social organization of our societies, crisis of the classic democratic system, vulnerability of national boundaries, you can tell it now, economic inequalities, inadequacy of uncoordinated individual actions in front of global phenomena. All these are just some of the instances of a profound ongoing process that is utterly changing our societies. Not that it appeared in the last few years, and even less in the last few weeks or months. These phenomena have been shaping the world scene for a long while already. Yet, we are attaining, probably have attained, a critical stage in the transformation of the world. If I may borrow a classic pragmatist expression, in the world order. And this transformation is forcing us to reconsider the boundaries of our action in a more profound and diverse way than we had expected. Over the last 2 years, we witnessed the return of nature as a core concern of philosophy itself. Not nature as an abstract product of the human mind, but nature as a concrete, physical, corporeal agent of our lives. Today, I'm obviously referring to the pandemic. Today, concerns of biological nature are supplemented, if I may say so, by the threat of lasting and worrisome military actions brought on by extensive rearrangements of global relationships. We are probably entering, I'm persuaded we are, an era dominated by state civilizations, to use a popular terms, or if we go back to classic political vocabulary, we are entering a time of empires. In this inherently cosmopolitan world, which its pros and its cons, the very notion of boundary takes a brand new meaning. As philosophers, we are called to revise our understanding of the world, to dismantle the traditional conceptual and cultural boundaries through which we have been used to think and describe the world, and to reconstruct them on largely new bases, most of which are still unknown to us. So philosophically, it's kind of an exciting time, if we can say something like that in front of the present situation. In any case, this is just an outlook on the future, and this is one of the reasons why I would like to congratulate again our colleagues at the RVC for organizing this meeting and pursuing this line of research, among other ones. At this stage, all I can do is to share these very simple thoughts, probably very trivial thoughts with you, and wish the best success to the seminar. And thank you for giving the opportunity to attend it and to listen to you. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you very much, Luca.
Thank you so much, Scarantino, Professor Scarantino. May I request Professor Barbieri to give his opening remarks. Thank you so much.
Sure. Thank you very much, Professor Mukherjee. And thank you for moderating this event today. I too won't take too much time because we want to reserve as much time as possible for our delightful speakers today and for a discussion. I will say a few words, though, about RVP's connection to this theme today, philosophizing across boundaries, because really, in a basic sense, that could be the motto for RVP and for the work that it has been doing over the last 5 decades, really going back to the late 70s. In fact, the original work of RVP was working across the Iron Curtain. That was the boundary at the time that was at issue there. And the organization took shape out of efforts to take philosophical resources and bring them to bear in building bridges between East and West at the time. That was the principal political boundary division border in the world. Over the decades, RVP has moved on to philosophizing across different boundaries. It has been able to try to bridge what Huntington described in the 90s as the clash of civilizations, by bringing together scholars in the so-called Muslim world, for example, with scholars from a number of other civilizational traditions. We've moved to continue work on the north-south divide as a sort of boundary, boundaries that have been thrust up in the fortunes, the miscellaneous fortunes of globalization. And listening to Professor Scarantino, it makes me wonder if in the near future, we won't also be devoting some of our resources to philosophizing across the human nature divide, as ecological questions move more and more to the forefront of philosophical consciousness. Now, all of this work that RVP has been engaged in has been in line with the basic goals of the organization, which do aim to promote philosophical research into culture, but at the same time to bring cultures together. I quote from some of the goals of the Council for Research in Values and Philosophy. These include to understand cultures and to develop a positive yet critical appreciation thereof. We seek commonalities, but at the same time, we respect differences. Also, to build cooperation among peoples by healing deep tensions and promoting peace and cooperation on a global scale. In this work, we are very pleased to have been able to work together with the World Congress on Philosophy and with FISP over the years. Well, philosophizing across boundaries describes the general work of RVP, but in a much more specific way. It is the focus of the workshop today. And it's interesting, of course, simply to look at the screen. If you have the mosaic feature on in your Zoom feed, you can see a veritable United Nations of scholars from different places and different traditions coming together to discuss our topic today. I always, in a meeting like this, I have to pause and just thank everybody who comes together in this space and indulges people like me, native English speakers, by engaging English, which is not necessarily an easy language. Many people bring different traditions and languages together to these discussions, but I very much appreciate the fact that people make the commitment to engage in a common language. More than that, what we have today on the program is world philosophy, and a glimpse at the titles of the different presentations today bears that out. We have a type of cross-cultural dialogue that is engaged in a common project that I think we can call world philosophy, even as we work out what that means. But the focus today is not on globality so much as it is on boundaries and the issues that boundaries present for the work of philosophy. And philosophy is as powerful a tool as any, I would add political theory to that, in revealing how boundaries, which historically have in many cases been taken to be natural, boundaries among peoples, boundaries among languages, and so on. Philosophy underscores how boundaries are essentially human creations, even if they draw on what might be given, established relations that we find ourselves thrown into. And because boundaries are human constructions, they raise important ethical questions about the character and quality of boundaries. As Luca mentioned, we live in a world where for the last several years now, we've seen a heightening of political divisions. We've seen a rise of populist movements that seek to close down interchanges of various sorts, limit migration, fence in, as it were. In some cases, quite literally, you've had human chains set up on national boundaries designed to enclose and cut off some cultures, some political communities from others. We see that boundaries of this sort can be divisive. We see, of course, in our current experience, but not only in our current experience, that contested boundaries can produce conflict and war. And for all those reasons, there are good grounds for criticizing and challenging boundaries. But at the same time, as philosophers, we know that boundaries are also important and play many positive roles in our lives. And they do help define cultures and help define philosophical traditions, for example. So the question becomes, critically speaking, what are the beneficial features of boundaries? What are the features of boundaries that we need to change and find ourselves perhaps in a position to change? Philosophy lays bare the critical features and gives us tools for critiquing and for critiquing boundaries and for promoting solidarity and other positive responses to boundaries. I want to mention in passing that this theme is related to our next RVP seminar that will be hosted by the McLean Center in Washington, D.C. in the fall. I see that Professor Vilicha has joined us today. He'll be hosting that. But the theme this year is Political Order and the Ethics of Peace. And it's going to highlight the project of trying to build up international relations and institutionalize peace ethics that can manage boundary disputes and promote peace, and at the same time draw together people from very different countries in constructive relations of cooperation. So I hope some of you may end up being involved with the work of that seminar come August and September. There's a big problem that Luca mentioned as well in world philosophy that is also related to boundaries that I just want to mention in passing, and that is the issue of the legacy of a kind of Western colonial hegemony in the philosophic world. And RVP has joined FISP and other groups in trying to work to bring all of the valued traditions of different peoples, of different cultures, to give voice in the global philosophical exchange. We remain committed to that activity and find it to be a very important movement today, the development of truly intercultural philosophy. And I hope that this workshop, this meeting today will constitute one small step in that direction. It remains for me to offer up some thanks to those who've helped make this event possible today. Again, I want to thank Professor Asha Mukherjee for generously hosting today. and my colleague Luca Scarantino, a fellow comparative ethicist, for his remarks and for his collaboration with RVP well beyond this event. I want to thank our panelists as well, some of whom have generously joined us in relative short order. It's a great pleasure to meet the legendary Professor Waithe today on the Zoom, and Professors Nee and Hurtado, and my friend Karim Crow, who is a fellow here at the McLean Center in DC. But I want to single out for special thanks Professor Robert Neville, who is someone who, more than anyone I know, truly embodies the idea of philosophizing across boundaries. He has done important work in a number, a kind of sobering number of different traditions. And along the way, he's been a very valued supporter of RVP's activities. He's helped with the board. He's a council member. And again, as a comparative ethicist, I have enjoyed a kind of mentorship through him and his work, which is really unparalleled in bringing together East and West in certain respects. So Bob, it's wonderful to see you again today. Thank you for joining us as well. Lastly, I want to thank Huye Ping as well. This is one more brainchild of hers, and once again, I think she's pulled together a terrific event. Well, thank you all, and I look forward to a stimulating discussion today.
I'm sorry.
Thank you.
You're okay, Asha.
I'm so sorry. It's so difficult to manage with the others' laptop, you know. Well, Professor Barbieri, thank you so much for making my task easy, and also sort of introducing the kind of speakers more deeply, and the panel today, and also bringing the close relationship of RVP and FISP, you know, how jointly they have been working for more than 5 decades. And in fact, I really wanted to remember our founder of RVP, Professor McLean, and his contribution, lifelong contribution and dedication to this cause. And in fact, maybe if the time permits, maybe at the end, as concluding remarks, I might add some things. But let me now invite our first speaker, Professor Robert Neville, to whom Professor Barbieri has already said that he embodies the philosophy across the boundaries. And I mean, since to CRVP and the people who are connected to CRVP is very well known, he actually needs no introduction at all. But maybe for Indian audience, I might introduce him by a few words. Professor Neville is a faculty at Boston University and will speak on the adoption of boundaries and going beyond them, ultimacy as a model. Neville's most significant scholarly contributions are his metaphysical theory of being, or being itself, entitled Theory of Being, his 3-volume Axiology of Thinking. The first volume is in that trilogy is Reconstruction of Thinking, which came out in 1981. Then Recovery of Measure, Interpretation and Nature, which was published in 1989. And Comparative Theology, he has been writing on comparative theology. Neville is also well known as a religious studies scholar, especially for his comparative theology. He has authored several books in the field of comparative religion, The Tao and the Daimon, 1981, Behind the Mask of God in 1991, Boston Confucianism, 2000, Ritual and Defense in 2008, and Realism in Religion in 2009. Robert Neville is a proponent of Confucianism as a world philosopher, together with several scholars from the Boston area of the United States, especially including Tu Wei Ming of Harvard University. His contributions to Chinese philosophy have resulted in his being given as an honorary Chinese name, Nenlo Shana. I'm sorry for all my pronunciation. I mean, since I'm not a Chinese scholar and also sort of, I'm not familiar with so many, pronunciations. So please excuse me. I request for, I'm apologizing to all my panelists for maybe not having the correct pronunciation. So yeah, so with these words, I invite Professor Neville to deliver his talk. It's a great privilege to have him on our panel. Thank you so much, Professor Robert Neville.
Thank you. Let's see if we can get my picture on the screen. Well, let me say first, thanks to the people who run this show, RVP. It's an extraordinary collection of people that you've brought together. It's also a very, very important topic. And the topic is within philosophy, but also it extends way beyond philosophy. And it's hard to draw the line between philosophy and political theory and ethics and religion and theology. So all of these lines are drawn differently in different cultures. I'm also pleased to be introduced to this array of scholars. This is an extraordinarily broad array of scholars, and I'm very pleased to meet you all. I've known Peimin for a long time, and Bill Barbieri and Hu Yeping. It was over 20 years ago that I undertook a trip through Asia, starting off in Xi'an and going as far as Sichuan, and lecturing in Urumqi, and coming back to Beijing. We got along fine. General Hu did all the translating, so I'm not quite sure what they heard of what we said, but it was a wonderful experience. And I remarked at the time that it was unusual. It was the first time, I believe, that the people from RVP had gone to China. And I notice also now that only Peimin is from China, but he's not really from China. He's from Grand Valley, and that's so he's an American who's doing philosophy. This spread of different philosophical perspectives is something greatly to be desired. I think all of us are in favor of expanding beyond where we began to pick up on kinds of philosophy that are new to us. There are so many of these kinds that they are kind of bewildering. And yet, in my own work, I have worked very hard to learn the basic thought patterns of South Asian and East Asian philosophies, as well as those that run from west to east and from east to west. But I don't understand all that much, just a little bit. But it's a balance that I have tried to achieve. I think it's important that we pay attention to all of these things which are now enticing us to move beyond our beginnings. And I want to say that it's very important for us to look to what's new. But that's far where we are now in 2022. And most of us are still, like me, not very good at a lot of the other kinds of philosophy than the ones that we had as our elementary philosophical education. If you think about where we will be in 50 years, I think the situation will have changed a great deal. Now, 50 years, that's an arbitrary number. Might mean 25 years for some or 75 for others. But I think that what's going to happen is that we will all assume the philosophical backgrounds of just about everyone and operate out of those backgrounds. A number of you have had Western educations, and we all know that you can study Greek philosophy and German philosophy and French philosophy and English philosophy. And everybody has that as a kind of a background, even though we might specialize in one or another. And we might use the philosophy to step out into philosophical modes of thought that are not particularly historical. But I think that this situation where we have many different parts of philosophy from the European perspective, that situation will hold for the whole of philosophy. So that in 50 years, it won't be that we look to see who's doing what. We will pay attention to the whole of philosophy. And that, I think, is an important issue. Now, what does this mean? It doesn't mean that we'll be any less specific. I think that we will have to be specific in our philosophical inquiries. But the makeup of them is going to come from a much broader comparative base. And that is where I believe we will go. So let me end my initial remarks there and pose this question, if I might, for the other speakers and for the audience. Is it a loss or a gain to have to look to the whole global philosophical panorama in order to find our background? That's the question. Is it a loss or a gain? Thank you very much.
Thank you. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Professor Neville. You have already set the ball rolling. And I guess we will address your question. I would request other panelists to address the question. But let me open the floor for some discussion. People can raise questions. We have about 7 to 10 minutes for the discussion.
Can I ask a question
Yes, please.
to Bob? Thank you, Bob. And if you
Yes.
say in 50 years, philosophy, there's no specific philosophy or philosophical school, but what do you define philosophy?
Well,
It's
that's how I define philosophy
yeah.
is not as important as the function of many different philosophies as forming the background out of which we think. And so it's the background that I'm concerned about here. And the background will consist of, well, all the people represented here, plus a greater representation of Chinese philosophy. I don't know that we have any Russian philosophers and how they would come out after the anger that has been developed in the recent war. There are lots of things that will happen in 50 years that we have to pay attention to, but I'm concerned about the background out of which we come.
Yes, please.
May
Yes, Luca, please. Yeah.
I ask a question?
Please.
Karim Crow here.
Yes.
Professor Neville, thanks for your interesting remarks. Does this imply or require a new understanding of translation? Because if this global effort includes in the background the multiplicity of cultures and ways of thinking, then we have an issue of putting it into the common discourse, which right now is English. It used to be French and other languages in the past. And increasingly, this also brings with it that Western colonial legacy that Professor Barbieri mentioned. And is this going to be a problem? Or should we seek a kind of multilingual way of discourse? Briefly.
Well, I think that you're absolutely right in pointing out the need for a common language. Now we have philosophers that work mainly in English, but that's because we don't know how to talk to the philosophers that don't speak English. I don't really know what will happen in 50 years. It might be that the Chinese language will take over. It could be that one of the Indian languages, or it could be that English will simply expand and be the proper form for philosophy. I suspect now that English will expand. It has taken charge now, but it certainly is a problem to watch, and surely it will be a surprise if some other language comes in. Yep.
Luca, you have something to say?
Professor Scarantino wanted to ask a comment, and then I would like to.
I just wanted to make a very brief comment, but it's kind of useless now. I certainly fully share the outlook on the next how many decades that Professor Neville just provided. I think it's exactly where we're going to. But I would like to add that for some of us, that's not just a vision, it's also the work that we have to do. I mean, what will happen is how we will shape the world of philosophy for the next day. And I think there is a growing number of scholars all over the world who are working hard on that, making it possible to go into that direction. So we can have a kind of a theoretical vision about that, and I certainly agree with the one that Professor Neville presented, but at the same time, we also see it in daily work, that we are actually going into that direction, despite some local resistances that are still observing, especially in Europe. particularly about the idea that what would philosophy become if it opens up, and I think it becomes a better philosophy, or a more comprehensive or a more insightful philosophy. But just to comment that for what Professor Neville described as an outlook, for many people is also it's not just an outlook, but it's also a task that we're trying to implement. So this is our daily commitment, and I think it's also what many of us are trying to teach students to do as an approach. Just open up your mind and try to see things from as many points of view as possible. So
yes, I think that that one of the things that is happening European philosophy and American philosophy in this engagement is the recognition that philosophy marks a way of life, and therefore it's not all that distinct from what we in the West call religion and a political theory and ethics and so forth. So I suspect that European and American philosophy will be changed in this way.
If I may, I don't know where our coordinator
Yeah, please.
Well, thank you, Professor Neville, for the remarks. I would like to add a third question, and that would be about the dangers of the development that we are engaged in. Because, well, one of my concerns for the next 50 years, well, I will not be there in 50 years, very likely, is will there be philosophy in 50 years? Would we have, you know, this kind of tradition that was built up across the centuries, during many centuries, in particular languages, Greek, Chinese, then later German, French, English, etc. So I'd like to ask you, do you not think that with this, I mean, discourse of globalizing philosophy, are we not entering into an age of superficiality? And many people accuse English of being a rather superficial language, because it's most of the time used for commercial ends. Of course, if you read any great thinker in English or read Shakespeare or any great poet, you see how deep the language can be. But for the world, can we not expect, will that not be expected that Chinese be good in doing philosophy in the Chinese way? And so across all the languages, because as we know, a language is profoundly constitutive of what we are. So it's not a danger that if we move on too quickly to an universal language, in the end, we'll be throwing out the baby with the water, you know, the used water, as the Germans would say. So that will be my observation about the danger of the thing. So what do you think?
Well, I think that language is very fluid. And we see now in English, the language of that's used on the internet, that's abbreviated, it's not very subtle, and so forth. At the same time that there's a reaction against that on the part of philosophers and writers and political theorists and even scientists. And this is going to be a wobbly, but I think still very important part of the development of philosophy's language. It will have to be continually renewed out of the commercialized reduction of it. Now, it could be that Chinese is having the same problems that we are. I suspect that a lot of Chinese newspapers are increasing the volume of their readership by decreasing the number of words that you need in order to read them. And so they're going to have their problems too. I also suspect that for the most part, different cultures are going to have different languages for some of their philosophy, and English, or what results from English, as another part of their philosophy. So there'll have to be some translation. I don't know in 50 years, I doubt that there will be one common language for the whole globe.
May I ask a question?
But Professor Neville,
Yeah, please. Asha, please.
Yes. Yeah, okay. Thank you, Professor Neville, for a very insightful presentation. You talk about the language, and you predict that English will remain a kind of dominant language when in the context of philosophy. So I would like to change a bit, but it's not so much in terms of religion, where in the past, religion was strongly connected with philosophy. If we don't say they are, one, but in contemporary context, we see sometimes religion is antagonistic to philosophy, or they're taking two different lines. Where do you see the future relations between philosophy and religion? So I would like to hear your reflection on that.
Yes, well, I've thought a great deal about this. And I think that, first of all, religion is something that is to be studied within philosophy. Philosophical theology is a legitimate and important part of philosophy. And that's the term philosophical theology, of course, is it uses theology, which reflects certain religions, but not others. There are some parts of philosophy, logic, for instance, that have little to do with religion as it stands now. But who will say in 20 years whether or not there's a logic of theology, or whatever we call the religious scope of philosophy. So I think that philosophy is much broader in its topics, but it's not necessarily antagonistic to religion. By definition of religion is that it has ideas about what is ultimate. It has existential practices that relate you to what is ultimate, and it has practices that are public in a broader sense. Now, all of those are isolated, and they should not be. But I think that means that every culture has something to do with religion, and that it need not be opposed to philosophy in any way. Thanks.
Thank you very much.
I can't resist the opportunity to just throw in one quick question to you, Bob. You know, you're casting your imaginative vision out 50 years in advance. But let me ask you the retrospective question, because you've been philosophizing for 50 years now. What are, you know, the most noteworthy changes in your métier that you observe now, thinking back to when you started?
Well, the most important is that 50 years ago, hardly anybody was interested in philosophizing across boundaries. So I graduated from graduate school in 1963. That was a long time ago. There were no Chinese philosophers in my study, no Buddhist or Hindu philosophers, or no Muslim philosophers. It was all Plato, Aristotle, and the West following from that.
You were able to bridge the divide between Europe and North American analytic philosophy.
Yes, but I didn't pay that much attention to analytic philosophy. I was a student of Wilfrid Sellars, who was a very great analytic philosopher. But we met by talking about his father, who was an American philosopher of very great note. It was at Fordham when I was teaching there in the late 60s that I met Thomas Berry. Thomas Berry was an unusual person, and we were standing in a room that was shared by the philosophy and religion departments, and he asked me what I was going to teach. I said the history of philosophy, and he asked what books I would use for Indian and Chinese philosophy, and I was completely befuddled by that. And before we could zip up, he explained that this was something that had to be corrected, and he signed me up. And ever after that, I've taught those kinds of philosophy. That was very unusual. And I didn't have anybody else in the philosophy department who taught Chinese and Indian philosophy. The analytic philosophers still are not much interested in that. The continental philosophers are, but they have a hard time seeing the other positions as standing on their own. Rather, they look at them as colonies, terrible colonies of the West. So the philosophy that I think is best in the West for engaging Indian and Chinese philosophy is pragmatism. But that's just my choice.
Thanks.
Thank you very much, Professor Bob. I think probably that's your last word contribution. We might go further to the second speaker, as Asha has some problem with her connection.
Yeah, so, I'm sorry. I'm sorry. My video is not working, but I can introduce.
Dr. Who, can I say a word?
I guess we will have to sort of stop this discussion right now. Because,
one word, two words. Okay.
Okay. 1 or 2 words. Yeah. Okay. Go ahead. Raj. Yeah. Go ahead.
Are you telling me to speak, Asha ji?
Yeah. Very short.
Okay.
Very short.
Just very quickly. Inspired by Professor Robert, I just have a word for Dr. Asna Hussain, who asked for some kind of relationship between philosophy and religion. I would think that seen from an intercultural perspective, if we think of philosophy, religion, and culture as 3 human acts, I would think of a philosophy as, as the scrutinizing eyes, which helps us to undertake the human journey. And I would see religion as the legs, which practically help us to go towards that goal, which our eyes are able to see, and the culture as the ground on which we undertake this human pilgrimage. Now, the question of interculturality will come when we are able to recognize that we are not only seeing, but we are also hearing. And therefore, we would take seriously those philosophies who have paid attention to the feminine dimension of reality, such as the Indian tradition and so on. And then we will recognize that the legs are meant for co-walking, not for kicking each other. And therefore, that interreligious co-walking together. And of course, the recognition that there are multiple boundaries and grounds. Ours is not the only ground in which we undertake the human journey. And perhaps we need to convert the boundaries into bridges, and we need to become pontiffs. So
Thank
this, I
you,
think,
thank you.
is the
Yeah, thank
relationship
you,
that
Raj.
I'm seeing
Yeah.
very quickly for you.
Thank you so much, Raj, for the comments. Yeah. Let me thank from our heart to Professor Neville for wonderful presentation and sharing his almost 5 decades experience and how the world is changing, at least those people who are sort of especially his own experience at Boston, where I mean from Wilford Sellers to the change from Wilford Sellers to welcoming the Buddhist scholars and Chinese scholars and Indian scholars as students and sort of providing a platform. So the world is changing, no doubt about it. With this hopeful kind of comment, let us move forward. Let me invite Professor Peimin to present his talk on world philosophy as a way of Kung Fu. His main interests are Chinese and comparative philosophy, modern European philosophy, philosophy of causation, and more distinctively his own approach, Kung Fu, Kung Fu philosophy. I guess this Gong Fu and Kung Fu, they are the same, which is outlined in his New York Times article, Kung Fu for Philosophers and Philosopher for Kung Fu. Philosopher Lee is a founder and former president of the Association of Chinese Philosophers in America and former president of the Society of Asian and Comparative Philosophy. He has served as the editor-in-chief of the ACPA book series on China, New York. He has served as many Chinese universities like Fudan University, Wuhan University, Jin University, and also served as a visiting professor at University of Hawaii and University of Hong Kong, Peking University, and distinguished professor at Beijing Normal University as an active participant of Global Dialogue of Civilizations. He has published numerous books, including on Confucius, on Reed, Wandering Brush and Pen in Philosophical Reflections, Confucius meaning the way great, Confucius, the man and the way of Kung Fu, Understanding the Analects of Confucius, a new translation of Lung Yu and Anatolius, which is published from SUNY in 2020. He has written around 70 journal articles and book chapters. Professor Peimin is also an accomplished Chinese calligraphy artist. He won the second place award at the Grand Rapids Art Festival in June 2002. So with this few words, I invite Professor Peimin Lee to give his talk. Thank you, Professor. The floor is yours.
Thank you for the introduction and for inviting me to this impressive panel. And I'm so glad to see you, Professor Neville, and see you, Luca. Last time we saw each other, Luca, we were in Beijing, across the boundaries. And that was 2018, I believe, the Beijing World Congress of Philosophy. And Professor Neville, we saw each other at the beginning of the pandemic in San Francisco the last time. And you know, when you mentioned me, you said that I was actually from China and from Grand Valley State University in America. Indeed, again, this indicates that cross boundaries, that theme wonderfully chosen for the next World Congress of Philosophy. Now, the key word that I'm going to talk about today is Kung Fu. And for the world today, this term needs no translation. Virtually everybody knows it. Of course, most people know it through the martial arts. To them, Kung Fu means Jackie Chan, Jet Li, and the cool cartoon figure known as Kung Fu Panda. However, the term Kung Fu in Chinese actually applies to all arts of life. from most ordinary survival skills to most advanced spiritual exercises. Indeed, in the circle of Chinese philosophy, the term has been particularly applied to the Songming Neo-Confucian cultivation of the heart mind. Yet, since the term can be applied much more broadly to mean the art of living in general, many scholars, including myself, have argued that discourse on Kung Fu is a characteristic of the entire Chinese philosophical tradition, including Taoism and Buddhism and some others. Furthermore, as a realm of discourse, I think Kung Fu has no nationality. Although the term is originally Chinese, it is not a patented intellectual property that belongs exclusively to the Chinese philosophical tradition. Not only do all religions from their origin have traditions of cultivating spiritual powers, in ancient Greece, philosophy was also a way of life, a spiritual exercise that aims at enabling a person to live better, and hence can be considered a practice of Kung Fu as well. However, that ancient tradition of philosophy as a way of life declined in history. It was gradually replaced by philosophy as a pure theoretical discourse. The tendency began as early as Pythagoras and Plato when they narrowed the meaning of philosophy from exercising one's curiosity and intelligence down to rational speculation, aiming at reaching the eternal truth by contemplation. Since then, philosophy gradually takes ideas, propositions, and theories as its object and purpose, and excluding technique and phronesis as unworthy of its serious consideration. By the 19th century, this, what I call narcissism of reason, eventually turned philosophy into a specialized academic discipline. A system of theoretical discourse exists in books, journals, conferences, classrooms, and of course in brains, detached from the ordinary life. This narcissism of reason allowed philosophy to maintain its relative independence and avoid the pitfall of becoming a servant of political power and material interest. But it has also led to a serious paralysis in philosophy as well. One indication of this paralysis is the astonishing absence of attention toward knowing how in philosophy. Now think about this. Humans cannot live without knowledge about how to do things, and yet knowing how was like a large hole in the emperor's cloak, and absent in philosophy discourses until the middle of the last century. For the same reason, for a long time, traditional Chinese discourses about Kung Fu were ignored in the academic circle because they did not seem fit into the rational framework of philosophy defined by mainstream Western philosophy. Ironically, the more philosophy becomes a specialized academic discipline, the further it is away from its original meaning, the love of wisdom. Reflections about this problem began as early as in the 19th century when Nietzsche criticized obsession of reason and called attention to styles of life, when Karl Marx emphasized the importance of practice, and when American pragmatists advanced a paradigm shift to practical implications of ideas. By the middle of the 20th century, systematic deconstruction of modern rationality swept the Western world. Along with these trends, some constructive ideas and theories started to push forward the direction of real-life practice, including Gilbert Ryle's work on knowing how, Wittgenstein's work on ordinary language, Michael Polanyi's task knowing, Merleau-Ponty's theory about the body, and Foucault's technique of self, which was directly translated into Chinese by some scholars as Kung Fu. As we all know, There was a linguistic turn in the last century. What is noteworthy is that in the heydays of that turn, Richard Rorty already predicted in the very introduction of his famous book, The Linguistic Turn, that the only moral that can be drawn from this turn is that the meta-philosophical struggle of the future will center on the issue of reform versus description, of philosophy as proposal versus philosophy as discovery. Now, to a certain degree, this future has already happened in the present. In the realm of metaphysics, Heidegger's phenomenology and Gadamer's hermeneutics have urged us to study our existence in the world and our understanding as a way of human existence. In the realm of ethics and epistemology, the revived interest in virtue has placed the formation of human being back into the focus. In socio-political philosophy, Amartya Sen and Martin Nussbaum's capability approach opened the door for taking enabling humans as a serious socio-political issue. And in aesthetics, Zachary Simpson's Life as an Art and Richard Schusterman's theory of soma aesthetics have treated human life as a field of artistic creation. In the realm of history of philosophy, Pierre Hadot's interpretation of ancient Greek, Rome philosophies as a way of life, showing the origin of Western philosophy is related to Kung Fu. And the trend also is reflected in themes of the recent congresses of World Philosophy, World Congress of Philosophy. The theme of the 2003 conference in Turkey and the 2008 conference in South Korea were respectively philosophy facing world problems and rethinking philosophy today, showing a general consensus that the philosophy in the world today must turn toward world problems and not remain isolated in its ivory tower. The following 2013 conference in Greece had the theme philosophy as inquiry and way of life, which shows a keen awareness for philosophy to regain a balance between theoretical inquiry and the art of living. The 2018 conference in Beijing, China had the theme learning to be human. It turns toward the core of Kung Fu because the art of living requires humans to be transformed into being artists and not mere speculators. The next conference, the one that will be held in Italy, will have the theme world philosophy across boundaries. This theme encourages philosophy to step out of the boundary of its ivory tower and become relevant again in the world. From these, we can say that there is a larger scale trend in world philosophy, a turn from being alienated, irrelevant theoretical discourses about an objective world back to be an art of living in the actual world and a way to transform ourselves. More importantly, there is an urgent need to have such a turn. That means even if we did not already have a trend that I outlined above, we would still need to promote it. The existential condition of human being today is so disturbing that philosophers cannot afford to remain in our irrelevance without thinking about very sustainability of ourselves at the most fundamental level. The recent events in the world, from the COVID pandemic to the Russian invasion to Ukraine, have warned us loudly how vulnerable we are as a species. The fact that humans came into existence was an extremely low probable incident, and now our extinction is a highly probable event that can happen anytime soon. The development of technology has far outpaced the degree of human maturity in using them responsibly. Our new acquired powers have allowed us to destroy our environment in a devastating speed, so much so that when I said to an environmental philosopher that we are like a caravan rushing toward the edge of a cliff, his response was, no, we are already off the cliff. He might be too pessimistic, but it should be clear that we do not have endless time. The term urgency used to be irrelevant to philosophers, but now we can no longer ignore it. If there is still any hope for humanity, we, as a whole species, have to grow mature and learn the basic kung fu of sustaining ourselves in the current time before it's too late. The famous statement on Karl Marx's gravestone says, the philosophers have only interpreted the world in various ways. The point, however, is to change it. This statement is a sharp criticism of the irrelevance of institutionalized philosophy, but it can mislead people to think that philosophy should be replaced by action. From the Kung Fu perspective, what needs to be overcome is not philosophy, but the boundaries that philosophy has put on itself. Since philosophy shapes people's way of thinking and mode of behavior at the most fundamental level, it's becoming irrelevant, has the effect of paralyzing human life. So we might want to modify Marx's statement into this. The philosophers may well have intended to only interpret the world in various ways, yet their ideas always affect the world, good or bad. The requirement to change the world does not imply that we should stop doing philosophy, but rather we do it in the right way, a way of affecting the world in the right direction. Like Waithe says, we should center on the issue of reform rather than description, of philosophy as proposal rather than philosophy as discovery. Using the Chinese word, we need to treat world philosophy as a way of Kung Fu. Now, the application of this term implies not only that we shift our attention toward unduly neglected area of human flourishing for philosophy today, but also a shift of philosophical perspective. The term Kung Fu directs our perspective to see things from their implications to human life. If we say that the Kantian transcendental perspective allowed him to reveal what must be the case if our knowledge of the world is possible, the Kung Fu perspective will allow us to reveal what must be the case if human survival and flourishing are possible. Naturally, this Kung Fu perspective finds its allies in many of the trends that I mentioned earlier. Among them, it resonates particularly well with pragmatism. One significant difference between the two, however, is that the term Kung Fu directs more attention toward the transformation of the person. The term pragmatism has its root in Greek term pragma, which means action or deed. It naturally directs people's attention toward actions and their consequences, and as a result, it leaves the agent in a blind spot, taken for granted as a subject of the will. This is reflected in the fact that pragmatist philosophers, such as John Dewey, call their theory instrumentalism. Instruments are commonly understood to be external to the agent and merely employed by the agent for pragmatic purposes. The term Kung Fu helps us to amend this liability and guide us more directly to a point that is vitally important today. That is, what is most important today is not whatever that may satisfy our insatiable desires, but the maturity of human beings. So to summarize the points that I tried to make, there is a larger scale trend in world philosophy, and a much needed one, that is trying to overcome the irrelevance of philosophy and moving toward the direction of philosophy as a way of life and a way of Kung Fu. The existential condition of humans on this planet urgently calls for such a Kung Fu turn so that we human beings can grow mature as a species. For otherwise, the hope that our very sustainability will diminish. This Kung Fu turn not only requires us to turn toward the practical life that we have neglected for a long time, but also a perspective from which we look at everything from their implications to the maturity of human being. That, when applied systematically, will likely lead to a broad and much needed transformation of the landscape of world philosophy. Thank you.
Yes.
Thank you. Thank you so much, Professor. Hello.
Yes, we can hear you, Asha. So if any reflections, comment, or questions, we can begin our discussion.
Yes, please. Yeah.
Bob, please unmute you. Unmute you.
Okay. Am I muted now?
Yes.
Yeah, I can hear you.
Thank you very much, Peimin. This is very much of a Chinese approach. How would you relate the philosophical questions having to do with the beginnings and endings of the universe to the areas of reforming human beings? I think that philosophy has to do with the beginnings and endings as well as with the reformation of human beings. Thank you.
I don't think philosophy had anything to do with the beginning of the universe. But we human beings need to become more mature as a whole species before we destroy ourselves. We extinguish ourselves in the universe. I mentioned that we have fast development of technology, and then the development of technology have far outpaced our level of maturity. We are like teenager, using strong muscles to do, driven by hormone, to do whatever we like. But then we put ourselves in danger of destroying ourselves. The recent events in the world show how vulnerable we are in the universe. So we have to, if there is still any hope, we have to get mature quickly. And that is the very topic of Kung Fu. Kung Fu is about becoming an art of life, artist of life. And I think we need to think in the scale of not only individuals, but also as a whole species. Human beings need to increase our Kung Fu.
Theo.
Thanks very much for that presentation. I just wanted to raise I know we're pressed for time, but I wanted to raise a kind of cross-cultural question. Kung Fu, the term for me has a strong implication of work, of exertion to it. It's not just any kind of practice, but something that takes concentration and effort. And in that respect, it reminds me of a similar term in Muslim thought, namely jihad, which, despite the fact that many people associate it with war or violence more broadly, in its basic sense, also means a kind of exertion, even a kind of spiritually oriented exertion. So I wondered, for our panelists, if any analogies between the roles that those notions can play in those two traditions might establish any common ground or sensibility. Maybe Karim can pick that up later on when he's up.
But the term Kung Fu is actually a name of a cluster of subconcepts, including time and effort spent on something, the ability to do something, the method of doing something, the approach of doing something, and the results of your ability of doing something. So it is a wonderfully vague term. if there is merit to vagueness, that is, it has a lot of implications and it has a lot of potentials for us to develop from there. But overall, it guides our attention to the maturity of the person who is capable of doing things, as well as the things that need to be done.
Mm-hmm. Good, thank you. We'll see if how in what ways other traditions focus a similar family of concepts like the ones you just mentioned.
May I?
Can I ask the
Yes,
question?
please. Yes, please. Go ahead, Professor Mamuka. Mamuka, yes, please.
Thank you. My question also relates to the both reports. And if we take the philosophy in the context of religion, in this case, we should reject the scientific nature of philosophy. And in the same way, if we take philosophy in contact with Kung Fu or spiritual systems or Chinese spiritual systems, also we should refuse these scientific points. So philosophy in this case is neither science nor art, but something middle, something practical exercise, free and easy exercises, which is similar to the spiritual systems of Chinese philosophy. Is it a reduction of the concept of philosophy in your mind or not? Thank you.
Well, I think we should reject the exclusivist approach to take like the scientific approach as the only legitimate philosophical approach and exclude others. Now, from the Kung Fu approach, actually scientific approach itself is a way of life also. And looking from the perspective of Kung Fu, we can look at the merits and the limitations of the scientific approach, what it can help, what it can, be problematic with this approach. Once evaluated from that perspective, I think we can better use the scientific approach.
Okay, in this case, also, okay, thank you.
Another question? Anil Tiwari?
Yeah, Anil Tiwari. Yeah.
Yes, good evening from India. Am I audible?
Yes, please.
I was wondering whether the cross-cultural communications can be meaningfully held if we use concepts in a definite sense, given the fact that the conceptual boundaries are variously understood. And if we look at philosophy from the perspective to follow in life, of course, there are various practices, consider political pursuits, religious pursuits, and spiritual pursuits. and philosophy has to have some answer for all these pursuits. It may not be an answer which is universally applicable, but certainly something which is essential, which must underlie when we answer to questions of different realms. As Professor Robert asked regarding the philosophical answer from Chinese philosophy or from any philosophy regarding the beginning of world or its final conclusion. So I wonder if the recognition of the other has got any underlying essential concept across philosophies, because this recognition is important if we are to enter in a meaningful dialogue. So can we figure out any such a concept which is functional, essentially functional behind the identification of other, because that is important for any dialogue or any communication. Thank you.
Thank you, Anilji. Thank you so much. Do we have any other question or comment?
Christoph.
Oh yeah, thank you very much. If there is time for still one short question, is there?
Please.
Yes, please. Yeah, the last one. Thank you. Yeah.
Thank you very much. Professor Ni, first of all, I would like to thank you very much for your presentation. I have a very practical question. If you consider Schusterman's endeavor, I mean some aesthetics, do you see any traces of using, let's say, Gongfu methodology of philosophizing in this kind of endeavor? Are there any Chinese philosophers taking this inspiration? Or are there any, let's say, relationships, maybe direct relationships between your approach and the Soma aesthetics by Richard Schusterman? Do you have any thoughts on that?
Yeah. I see a lot of allies everywhere. Actually, when I addressed the previous question, I think once you take out the Gongfu perspective, you can even take the narrow approach to philosophy as also a way of life, and then we can evaluate them, their merits, their limitations, their various implications to human life. As for allies, close allies, I see, Taoism, Buddhism, they are all ways of life. And I mentioned in numerous allies, particularly pragmatism in the West is an ally. Schusterman, he labeled himself a pragmatist, as aesthetic philosopher. And I see environmental philosophies, feminist philosophies, virtue theories, all moving toward similar direction. So I'm open to your suggestions about further trends that that we can all learn from and work together. This is my overall approach. Thank you.
Okay, thank you.
I just want to add one point. I think probably, if I understand correctly, Gongfu philosophy is kind of a practical wisdom, which is, as you said, Professor Peimin, is functioning as the previous scholar asking, what is a function for, it can be play a role, functioning role to cross cultures, communication or dialogues.
This can serve as a flag or a label that we can all work from there, and in each engage their own traditional resources. I believe in all worlds, major traditions, we have resources, unique resources can contribute. We don't necessarily have to use just this word, but in the end, we may find a whole bunch of words that mutually complement each other and offer us a more robust and resourceful pool of concepts and ideas.
Want to go the third speaker?
Yeah, thank you so much, Professor Finney, for wonderful exposition of Kung Fu and emphasizing on philosophy as Kung Fu helps us in overcoming not the philosophy but the boundaries of philosophy. That's perhaps the crux of the whole point, which actually brings us together on this particular panel. So we are not really overworking philosophy, but we are trying to overcome the boundaries which are created by us, the human beings. And in that sense, it's a kind of transformation, as you have said, of a person. Now, this transformation, how this transformation takes place is a very important aspect, And as you said, it's a very complex and vague process. But at the same time, perhaps that's the most important process through which one can realize that, can overcome the boundaries. So thank you so much for a wonderful presentation. Now let's move to the next speaker, Professor Mary Ellen Waithe, who is going to speak on contributions of women philosophers to world philosophy. We are delighted to have Ellen among us, and her areas of interest are ethics, including medical and legal ethics, professional and business ethics, philosophy of law, social and political philosophy, philosophical psychology. Her doctoral dissertation was Acting for Others Towards the Theory of Paternalism, which was published by SUNY Hunter College, New York. Professor Waithe has published intensively on many aspects of philosophy. Recently, she has edited series on women philosophers, especially focusing on non-Western women philosophers. And in fact, I had the pleasure of meeting her at the World Congress of Philosophy in 2013, held in Athens at panel I had organized on women philosophers, where Professor Gail Presley was also present. It's really a great pleasure to have you at our seminar today, Professor Mary Ellen Waithe, please.
I think we probably have difficulty hearing you again.
You couldn't hear me?
Let me try to improve my volume again. Okay, and the microphone is on.
I think that's already a bit better if you're closer to the.
Better.
Are you able to hear me and see me?
Yes, it's better.
Okay.
Yeah.
Okay, thank you very much. First, I want to really thank the organizers for this wonderful treat to be invited to speak to you. And although I live not far from Catholic University of America, I have yet to set foot in their phenomenal library, but I will probably come by this spring. I want to tell you about boundaries. This is a bit personal, but isn't it always? The story of boundaries, first from some autobiographical boundaries. The autobiographical boundaries for me started when I was in 7th grade, about 11 years of age, and I realized that I had a lot of questions about the religion in which I was being raised, Catholicism. And one day I asked my father, who was very devout, a question about miracles. Daddy, how is it that we know that something is a miracle created by God, or just something that science doesn't yet understand but will? He was so angry with me. He called me a goddamn philosopher, which hurt my feelings because at that time in my life, I thought philosophy meant prostitute. And he was talking about those nasty ladies who hung out on Times Square soliciting favors from men. And I thought, no, that's not me. I don't do that. So I saved my pitiful weekly allowance and got on the subway and went to Brooklyn Public Library, far from where I lived, so that my father wouldn't know that I had gone to the library. And I asked the librarian for books. Works of philosophy.
Cannot hear, Professor Waithe, Waithe cannot hear you.
Okay, can you hear me now? Is it better?
Very light.
Okay, I'll come closer and speak louder. Okay. So after finding a small enough book that I could conceal, a tiny little book on the top shelf, beginning with the A's, with Aristotle, one of the names of the A authors in the Dewey Decimal System, who was not Aquinas or Augustine, because my father had their books. So I picked up this tiny little book, Aristotle's Nicomachean Ethics, edited by Sir D.W. Ross. And I took it home, and under the covers at night, I read through it. And when I found the expression, the virtue of a knife is to cut, I thought, wow, that's impressive. I want to know more about this stuff called philosophy. So I wanted to go to university, but my parents didn't allow it. And then I moved out and went to university on my own. Later married, and my husband and I both were accepted to the University of Minnesota's philosophy department. And he was given a graduate scholarship and made a teaching assistant. So he would have teaching experience before he finished his PhD, and I wouldn't. And I asked them why I too did not receive economic support for my studies.
Your connection is off. Professor White, your connection is off and cannot hear. Would you like to ask someone to help you to fix the problem, or we can go for the next speaker?
Do you have my camera? Do you have me on camera?
Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah, now it's better. Yeah.
Okay, this is better. If I speak, can you hear me now? Okay.
Yeah.
So,
yeah, okay.
In my graduate studies, while researching for a thesis on paternalism, I was thumbing through an issue of Stobaeus and found there in the Greek Isara of Lucania. And I'm reading the Latin translation that faces, and I realize This truly is philosophy, her theory on human nature. So that began a very long process of producing 4 volumes of the history of women philosophers up until the end of the 20th century. And in these volumes, there was only maybe one non-Western woman might identified as a philosopher, the Japanese philosopher Murasaki Shikibu, who wrote as a novelist, but the novel is philosophical. And so then we started some of the boundaries that I tried to cross then was the lack of education, the lack of interest on the part of my parents in having me educated, the lack of graduate support because they made the poor choice of marrying a man who was a philosopher, and we're divorced now, by the way. And then boundaries to library research. There are many, many boundaries to library research, not the least of which is the fact that works by women of the far past, that is the Middle Ages and earlier, works by women were often bound with works by men. And so you had to go through the entire book, and I did. I went through the entire contents of all the shelves of one of the largest university libraries in America at the University of Minnesota, and that's where I was able to find most of the women philosophers. But there are still other boundaries and other problems that we have to address, and in the context of women breaking these gender barriers in philosophy, although we, women of my generation and Asha's generation, are not the first to break into, the first woman to be philosophers, certainly not, still our profession is, I think, very antithetical to, uninspired by the idea of having more women philosophers or more women publishing in philosophy, because as you see, it has really changed the nature of the discussion of philosophy with the introduction of feminist thought, and also raised very serious questions about the nature of the canon of philosophy. And the canon itself serves as a boundary because it includes men who did write small works of philosophy that were fairly unimportant, but does not include most women. Part of the reason, I think, is epistemological. We Western philosophers, at least, do not like to think that mystical experience is an aspect of epistemology. That is, mystical experience as a way to come to know, a way, in most cases, to come to know God, but it doesn't have to be coming to know God. It can be mystical experiences coming to know oneself, as is, I think, more common in the tantric traditions of philosophy, that Westerners tend to bar off and exclude from serious consideration as being philosophical. There are other boundaries that I think in my writing now I'm trying to dissolve, not resolve, but dissolve. And one of those is the distinction between philosophy and religion. And what I tend to do when I'm working with philosophical writings that have a heavy, heavy religious content to them is I try to scrape off to the side aspects of that religion that are simply devotional in nature. And for example, prayers that do not have philosophical content. But some prayers do have philosophical content, or are labeled as prayers when they are not, in the sense of an individual speaking, communicating with a divinity. So I leave off things related to worship, ceremonies, and things like that, unless it is obvious that it has a strong philosophical content. Women are crossing and erasing boundaries in philosophy. My own limitation is with respect to the number of languages that I don't know, and also I think trying to constantly overcome my inbuilt bias towards seeing things in a Western way. So I decided to stretch myself a little bit, a lot actually, and am in the process of completing a volume on non-Western women philosophers. And the title of the work is Women from Non-Western Philosophical Traditions, the First 4,000 Years. And we go from way before Christ until women philosophers who have of the West, of non-Western women philosophers who have died recently, and whose work therefore is considered truly history, done, finished, kaput. So how many of these women are there? Well, I don't know. I haven't counted lately. I'm going to make a very rough guess that it's somewhere between 200 and 300 women philosophers that we have identified their works as philosophical. And of these women, about 24 of them are from the non-Western tradition that I've identified. I expect that this book is going to generate information about many, many, many more women philosophers from all the Asian traditions, including Aboriginal thought from Australia, and including one or two women from mostly from the Muslim tradition from Africa. So aside from figuring out that I wanted to do philosophy, learning that there were barriers that I don't have to overcome in order to reach the ability to do philosophy, and also to open my mind and my heart to the possibility of doing philosophy in ways that are alien to me, but delightfully recognizable as philosophical. The nature of philosophy is changing, I think, and that's good. I think we're going back to being a little bit more open to looking at things like virtue theory and care ethics and feminism as genuine philosophies that are perhaps not of the strict analytic tradition, but nevertheless are a reasoned examination of important, significant thought. I want to spend just a moment recognizing some of the publishers who have assisted in getting out this information and producing these works by women philosophers. One of the first was Springer, whose predecessor I published my 4 volumes of the History of Women Philosophers. They are now putting out, and I'm one of the editors-in-chief of this series, along with my colleague Ruth Hagengruber from Paderborn University in Germany, whom most of you do know. Springer is putting out a series. We already have about 9 published, and there'll be about a total of perhaps 15 to 20 volumes in this series, one of which will be my non-Western women philosophers volume. So Springer has taken an important role as one of the world's oldest publishers of philosophy. They've taken a role to acknowledge women philosophers. They've also asked us to do an encyclopedia of women philosophers, and that is something that is on the burner. There are several centers in the world that I know of who are focused on the study of women philosophers and trying to break down the boundaries that we face in acknowledging their work as philosophical, or in some cases acknowledging the philosophical works as being authored by a woman. Another important and one of philosophy's oldest publishers, Brill, is now launching a journal. Again, I am co-editor-in-chief, a journal on the history of women philosophers and scientists. We decided to expand it to include scientists because so many women who focused in the general area of metaphysics were not allowed into academic philosophy and worked instead as physicists, or often in addition to being teaching philosophers, worked as physicians, as physicists, as chemists, and helped develop some of the founding theories of the sciences. So we come now full course, so to speak, past the boundaries that faced me and probably most of you in your youth, to being able to be an agent of change, to stretch the boundaries and admit that they were placed in the wrong place to begin with. So I think I'm going to end with those comments and invite any questions that you might have. And I apologize for the frequent problems with the audio. Thank you very much, and thank you so much again to the organizers.
Thank you so much, Alan. Well, the presentation is open for discussion.
Luca.
If I may, I think that everybody shares my question, because you are telling the story of you not being given a fellowship at the University of Minnesota, and that's exactly when the audio went out. So I'd really like if you could end the story and tell us how come you did not get it. And I think everybody is left with some curiosity about that.
Oh, I did not receive the teaching fellowship for any of the 4 years or the 6 years that it took me to do my doctoral dissertation. And the reason that was given by the chair of the department was when they have a married couple in the same department, they give the support to the man, period. And that was perfectly legal at that time. I want to mention, now that Luca's on screen, his wonderful wife, Sipakwati, who is also contributing chapters on my non-Western women philosophers. And I'm looking forward to her next contribution. And thank you, Luca, for supporting this work.
Well, thank you. Thank you. Thank you for the missing piece.
Will.
Thank you very much. This was a very helpful and very illuminating survey. But one phrase caught me when you were talking a bit about the relation between philosophy and religion. And the phrase was that prayer, that you were sort of looking at some prayers, and you talked about prayers that did not have philosophical content. And it struck me, could you say a bit more what you take to be philosophical content? Because you have a very broad, you offered us a very, very broad and expansive understanding of where we might find philosophy. You talked about mystical tradition, So could you give, maybe just say a little bit more about what you take philosophical content to be, and how you could maybe extract that from, let's call it, the religious traditions that in some cases might have been their home?
Thank you very much for your question, Bill, and greetings. Nice to see you again. We have, with respect to religion, let me tell you about one of my first big mistakes, okay? Here's the big mistake, has to do with prayer. I came across an article, was a small pamphlet that was a dissertation upon the Pater Noster, a dissertation upon the prayer, the Our Father, famous, the Lord's Prayer, it's often called. And I immediately passed over that. I wish I hadn't. Then I read it carefully in conjunction with Sir Thomas More's, this is by his daughter, with Sir Thomas More's persecution and so on. And I realized that this is not a work about the Pater Noster, the prayer, although it was packaged that way. She meant people to think so. It's really an analysis of the limits of the autonomy of the ruler, of the king. And it is about whether one owes greater obedience to one's king or to one's firmly grounded religious beliefs. So that's just one example of how the word prayer, which in earlier times meant things like petition or request or something along those lines. So I learned not to just simply ignore them ignore things labeled prayer when it obviously has a very strong civil disobedience context that puts it squarely within philosophy and without any question. The question Bill Sweet asked me was, well, am I stretching these boundaries too much? Yes and no. Yes and no. I'm putting this stuff out and I'm labeling it philosophy, and people can get out their slings and arrows, whatever. And I'm putting it out there for people to consider. Okay? There's no vote to be taken on who gets into the canon of philosophy and who doesn't. You all know the very important philosophical male philosophers who are in these canonical works, such as encyclopedias and so on. So in terms of distinguishing prayerfulness, if it is simply a supplication, God help me, whatever, then if it's simply a request for something personal, which most prayer is, then I consider it properly well within the province of religion and not philosophy. But the questions of cosmology, metaphysics, and so on come up within religion all the time. And those are philosophical debates. So, and I also don't think that, I think that we are Siamese twins, conjoined twins, and that sometimes it's dangerous to insist on a separation. They're not fully separate, but they are interdependent, philosophy and religion. So I don't have a problem with saying this is philosophy. I mean, like most of you, I taught philosophy for a quarter of a century or more. I think it's like pornography. You recognize it when you see it. And my question is, can you recognize this or not? If not, okay, you're not interested. If you do recognize this as philosophy, well, let's include it in our teachings, our writings, and so on. That's all.
Yeah. Okay. Thank you. Thank you, Professor Waithe, for giving us more insight into this relation between philosophy and religion and highlighting the boundaries. Thank you so much. So, well, let's move to our next speaker, Professor Pérez, Guillermo Hurtado Pérez. He's going to speak on Latin American perspective on world philosophy. Well, we just had perspective from women philosophers, and now we are moving towards Latin American perspective on world philosophy. Let me briefly introduce Professor Pérez. His research work covers numerous areas of philosophy, specializing in the lines of analytical philosophy, intellectual philosophy and history, and Mexican philosophy. He served as director of the Institute of Philosophical Research at UNAM from 2004 to 2012. He has also been a professor at ITAM, the University of Buenos Aires, and some other. Some of the titles of his published works are Resilient Propositions, 1998, The Owl and the Serpent, Essays on Philosophy in Mexico in the 20th Century, 2007, Why I'm Not Fallibilist and Other Philosophical Essays, 2009, and Mexico Without Today's Society, 2008, Mexican Philosophy Challenges and Perspectives, 2009, among others, as well as A. Rossi and E. Urenga and Philosophy of the Mexican, which may have been already out, which has already been published. He was the founding director of the second period of the journal, Dionia, and the editor was published from Argentina, Ideas and Values, Colombia, Mexican Studies, USA, and the Journal of Inter-American Philosophy, USA. So I invite him to present his views on the topic. Yeah, please go ahead.
Well, thank you very much for the invitation. I'm very glad to be here. I'm learning a lot of things. This is really a wonderful dialogue. I want to consider the concept of world philosophy from a Latin American point of view. Latin America has a long history of reflection about this topic, although perhaps not in a direct manner. One of the main questions of Latin American philosophy has been this. I mean, what is the place of Latin American philosophy in Western philosophy and in general in world philosophy? This question has been raised over and over, as if Latin American philosophers were not completely convinced that they are real philosophers, as if they needed the validation of other philosophers that are not worried about their own right to philosophize. The reason of this insecurity of Latin American philosophers is well known. From an Eurocentric point of view, philosophy could only be practiced properly in Europe and by Europeans. Americans, not only South Americans, but even North Americans, did not have the substance required to philosophize at the highest level. The Eurocentric point of view was not only adopted by Europeans, but by Americans themselves. A well-known Argentinian thinker of the 19th century, Juan Bautista Alberdi, claimed that America is condemned to put into practice what Europe thinks. According to this point of view, Latin Americans can study philosophy, of course, but can never aspire to be created philosophers themselves. They have to accept forever and ever the epistemic authority of Europeans. That's why for many Latin American philosophers, to philosophize was inevitably a task that required philosophizing across boundaries, but in a strictly physical meaning, because there was this idea that unless a Latin American student went to Europe to study philosophy, he would never be a real philosopher. So this idea of crossing boundaries for Latin American philosophers it's very common. Okay. Now, one of the first Latin American philosophers that rejected this philosophical Eurocentrism from Latin America was the Mexican thinker José Vasconcelos. José Vasconcelos, I'm going to share with you through the chat a page about Vasconcelos. Let me just see if I can share it. No, yeah. That's the Wikipedia page of José Vasconcelos, so you know a little bit more about this Mexican philosopher. Well, Vasconcelos lived in the first half of the 20th century, and he claimed that European philosophers consider European philosophy as universal philosophy when it is actually just another local philosophy, like Indian or Chinese philosophy. According to Vasconcelos, philosophical Eurocentrism was not only a blatant historical error and a philosophical mistake, but it was something else as well. It was part of the strategy of Europeans for world domination. Vasconcelos invited Mexicans and Latin American philosophers to create a philosophy of their own in order to resist in the realm of ideas to European colonialism. Vasconcelos claimed that the true ideal of philosophy was that of a human activity across borders, a common task of all human beings. However, he said, unless Europeans change their point of view about the rest of the world, such a universal philosophy would be practically impossible. I believe that although Vasconcelos' criticisms were well-founded, it seems to me that we cannot keep waiting for Europe or to the US to change in order to create a world philosophy. We need to take a different attitude, and we can find some ways of doing that in more recent Latin American philosophy. The Second World War had a strong effect among the intellectual circles of Latin America. Many of Latin American intellectuals were convinced, say in 1940, 1941, and not without reasons, that Europe was going to destroy itself, and hence that Western civilization would disappear unless it could be rescued in America. Latin American philosophers could not keep on reproducing in a passive attitude European philosophy. If Western philosophy was going to survive as an intellectual tradition, it would have to be continued by Latin American philosophers and North American philosophers as well. Now, as we know, Europe survived the Second World War, thank God. And hence, the long tradition of European philosophy also survived. But philosophy in Latin America had a great impulse since then. It could be said that Latin American philosophers gained more confidence. However, the structural conditions of the post-war philosophy did not change that much. For example, Spanish and Portuguese languages have not been able to compete with the extraordinary force of English language in the international philosophical community. The fact that we are speaking in English now is an example of the power of the English language and of the English-speaking philosophical community. A power that is not merely intellectual, but that it is also based on the political, economic, and military power of the United States and Great Britain. However, as I said before, we cannot wait for these structural conditions to change in order to do something to create a world philosophy. I believe there are some elements in Latin American philosophy that can help us to philosophize across boundaries. It is not possible in such a short time to describe all the philosophical proposals from Latin America that can sustain a philosophical dialogue of all human beings. I just want to offer a view about the nature and purpose of dialogue that could be useful for this purpose. It has been claimed that in order to have a dialogue with someone else, a deep dialogue with someone else, we require to be open to that person. Openness is hence a condition of a deep dialogue, such as the one we expect to have with philosophers of other cultures. However, openness is not enough. In order to go further in that dialogue, we have to accept an encounter with the other person that may transform me and the other person in a way that we did not expect before. The encounter between Europeans and original Americans that happened in the 16th century was no doubt a violent encounter. One group invaded, conquered the other. However, there was also a different kind of encounter that produced what is called mestizaje. Mestizaje. I will write the word here in the chat. Okay, mestizaje. There is not an exact translation of the word mestizaje into English. Perhaps we could talk of interbreeding, but it's not the same really. I mean, interbreeding doesn't capture all the conceptual richness of the concept of mestizaje. In French, we have the word métis, which perhaps is a little closer, but not completely, okay? Mestizaje is not only mixture, but is also a creation of a different entity. A mestizo in Latin America is more than a mixed race individual. It is a different kind of individual. The same can be said about philosophy. Latin American philosophy is not a mixture of European and American and originally American philosophy. It's more than that. It's a new kind of philosophy. A new kind of philosophy that has both backgrounds. Let's say it has 2 feet, 2 legs, but one leg in the European tradition, one leg in the original American tradition, but it's something else. That's why the metaphor of the mixture perhaps is not exact. It's not as mixing, let's say, wine and water. It's more like that, more than that. Another Mexican philosopher of the 20th century, Emilio Uranga, I will write his name down. Emilio Uranga, a brilliant Mexican philosopher of the last century, he criticized this idea of mestizaje as a mixture. Mestizaje, according to Uranga, is an ontological notion. No? To conceive oneself as a mestizo is to adopt a new horizon of possibilities. What I have in mind now is that a philosophical dialogue between different cultures, between different civilizations, should go beyond openness in order to embrace the adventure of change. In Spanish, it's easier to present this point because what we say is that we must move from abertura, openness, to aventura, adventure. The words are similar, so it's easier to make this point. No? From abertura to aventura. Philosophical dialogue has to be understood as an adventure that will change us in an unknown way. Once the dialogue has got to its last stage, we will not be the same. Then we will all be mestizos. We'll have a different identity, a new identity, an identity that will bring some elements of the identity of the other with which we have been dialoguing. That, I believe, is the last dimension of dialogue. And I believe that idea of dialogue, which has been developed in Latin American philosophy, could be useful to understand what sort of dialogue we can create in order to have a word philosophy. So what I propose is that is the development of a mestiza philosophy or mestizo philosophy. Mestizo philosophy is not a mixture of philosophies, as we have said. It's not a mixture, no? But it is a philosophy with different backgrounds that have been assimilated through a dialogue understood in this way. As I said before, this dialogue requires more than openness, more than tolerance. It requires something else, a will to self-transformation. I want to finish this talk with a remembrance of José Vasconcelos' more famous and optimistic book named La Raza Cósmica, The Cosmic Race, a book published in 1925. I'm going to share now a link to the book. Let me just give me a minute. So share it through okay. So then in this book of 1925, Vasconcelos claimed something that I think is still very important. No? He claimed that not a single race or culture can claim to be the sole vehicle of universality. No? I mean, the privilege of a universality did not belong only to one race or to one civilization or to one culture. Okay? But he claimed something else. He claimed that universality cannot be understood as an abstract condition, something that can be achieved by anyone at any time. So to speak, universality is not floating in a Platonic realm, no? So as if anyone can have an access to universality from its own particularity. No? Vasconcelos claimed that universality is a condition of the mestizaje of humankind, that is, of the interbreeding of humankind. Not only in a physical sense, of course, no? But in a cultural, intellectual, and ultimately spiritual sense. Now, a question that can be drawn now is whether we can achieve this universal mestizaje in order to create a world philosophy without losing our own identity. I think we can do that. No? If we have an idea of a dynamic identity, we can still be Mexican philosophers, French philosophers, Chinese philosophers, and at the same time be world philosophers. But that would suppose, as I have claimed, to accept a change of our own identity through a very, very deep dialogue, understood as an encounter and ultimately as an adventure, an existential adventure. Thank
you. Thank you very much, Professor Pérez. It has been extremely rich presentation in the sense that you're talking about, encountering the other with the dynamic identity. So the people, the person does not have a fixed identity, because normally we take identity as a concept which actually defines the individual, and defining in the sense of static, kind of position is accepted. But you're talking about dynamic identity, and I mean, it's a very complex notion, I'm sure about that, but we need to unpack a lot of things here. I mean, right now we will open the floor for the discussion. So let us have a few discussions on your presentation.
Yes, this is Michael Niba. I'm Cameroonian, and
yes, please welcome. Yeah,
my understanding of philosophy basically is it seeks to capture the way of life of cultures. I've been on this particular discussion since it began, and with reference, for example, to the author whom we just listened to, he seems to limit Latin American philosophy to the philosophies that are expressed in either the Spanish or Portuguese languages. What is spectacularly missing from that discussion is the native Latin Americans, the indigenous Indians who actually have the first right to that continent. The absence of any reference to African philosophy also in the discussions from the previous speakers is also very, very evident. I just want to ask, is it, number one, the case that, for example, these two peoples have no philosophies, and that if they, in a second instance, do have philosophies, they are not relevant to world philosophy or to the discussion? Because I think their absence still speaks of a certain colonial mentality that sought to treat these people as if they had no culture, and so no religion, no thought for themselves, no form of government, and so on. That's my little remark.
Should I answer that question? Yes.
Would you like to take right away, or I can see two more hands, so maybe we can take two more and then we can.
I would prefer to take this one.
Okay. Go ahead.
Yeah.
Go ahead.
Yeah, you're absolutely right. The first boundary that had to be crossed by Mexican philosophy in the last century was the boundary of mental colonialism, according to which only Europeans could practice philosophy. So it was not only 1954 that a very important book called The Nahuatl Philosophy was published, in which the philosophical significance of the thinking of original Mexicans was recognized in a public manner. So yeah, of course, you see, that's why I was telling you that I think that philosophers that come from ex-colonial countries, like Mexicans or people from other places of Africa and Asia, have had to cross all sorts of boundaries, not only physical, but also intellectual. Nowadays, Mexican philosophy is much more aware of the importance of philosophy written by, or not written, it was part of a verbal tradition by original communities, and also of the people that came from Africa, no, the African Americans. I think that we have a completely different position nowadays, but it's still changing. You see, we still have to cross lots of boundaries. Thank you.
Thank you.
Alan, may I express my gratitude? May I express my gratitude to you for very interesting reports about this South American philosophy. But to my mind, I think that if we consider the European tradition under the one concept of European philosophy, it's not always right, because European tradition consists of many colorful cultures, different countries. And to unite them under the one name, it means to reduce many points of this very colorful philosophical tradition. And on the other hand, when the South American philosopher wanted to distinguish himself from the European tradition or European universal philosophy, he considers his philosophy from the internal point of view, as his own philosophy of his homeland. But he considers at the same time European universal from the external point of view. And this correlation between internal and external is not always right, because we need partnership between two cultures from the external or internal position, but not internal with external. So we consider the European universalism from the internal point of view. There is not the difference, many points of difference between South African philosophy and the European tradition. So language also plays a very important role in the development of philosophical thinking. Let me say that I worked in the philosophy of quantum physics, and in quantum physics, I come to the point that there is a subject's invasion in the quantum sphere. And only the French philosopher Louis de Broglie confirmed this conception, because French language allow him to make the subjectification of objective situations in physics, because French language also has this ability to make some subjective form from the objective situation. It's not the ability to other language. So the French philosopher, only the French philosopher was agree with the conception of subjects invasion in quantum physics. It's my opinion, because the language sometimes determines the way of philosophical thinking. It is very important to take into account. So my point is that if we want to, the relation between South American philosophy and European tradition, we should consider them from the internal point of view, both philosophy, not from the one internal or another from the external position. That is my conviction. Thank you.
Yeah, thank you very much. I take that point. Thank you.
We have 3 hands already, and very quickly we'll have to sort of wind up this this particular presentation. Alan, would you like to say? Yeah, go ahead, please. We can't hear you.
What do you address to me?
Yes.
Yeah,
yes.
Now it's okay. Yeah, go ahead.
Okay. I'm wondering whether or not your concept of mestizo philosophy is perhaps illuminated by a biological concept, and that is the concept not simply of evolution, but the idea that from two existing things, a new species can be born, as we see sometimes in biology, that there is a different species that emerges from the two. And I think that your mestiz philosophy is closer to the idea of a new being coming into being. Am I wrong?
You're right. I think that is exactly the idea that I wanted to give. Thank you very much.
Yes. I would like to ask the gentleman who called in with just now with respect to your other question about having philosophy of the African nations be included or be considered to be philosophy and so on. And I would like to welcome him and not only other Cameroonian philosophers, but also from other places in Africa to take advantage of what they undoubtedly possess, that is multiple languages under their hand, and a knowledge of the regional culture and its history, and then introduce us to the philosophers, or if it's not an individual, if it's a group's philosophy that we might perhaps identify as a griot philosophy in some places in Africa, or by other titles. So I think that the answer to the underrepresentation in the contemporary canon of philosophy, the underrepresentation of not only women but the underrepresentation of Africans and Asian in the philosophical canon can be improved by local scholars bringing these materials to us and introducing them to us and translating them and making them available, because otherwise we do not know what they are. So I want to thank.
May I just have a quick riposte to that? I think it exists if and only if, I think, number one, we are prepared to admit that it is there, and number two, to actually think that it is relevant. There is vast literature in all the European languages on African philosophy. There is. So I just beg to differ that it is not because it doesn't exist. I still insist. I think there is still what the former speaker referred to as mental colonialism, that either that thought is not considered to be relevant or it is treated as non-existent.
Doubt that those prejudices are rampant. I do not doubt that at all.
Well, yours is also then a prejudice against the fact that I, as an African, I'm telling you, this is what is on the ground. If you think it's a prejudice, I guess you're very, very welcome.
No. That's not what I meant. You misunderstood me.
Yeah.
I'm saying that from the perspective of Western philosophy, I have no doubt that Western philosophers like me have been ignorant of or have ignored important works, important philosophical writings that come from the African continent, from all over the African continent. And I think clearly we have a lot of work to do. Thank you.
Okay, thank you.
Yeah, I request Luca and the other people
very
who are
briefly,
raising
thank you.
hands.
Asha, just a very briefly comment, a question for Guillermo. First of all, thank you for your presentation. So much in consonance with it. There is no need to say it, I think. But at some point you mentioned the idea, it's almost casually, the idea of self-transformation as the mechanism that leads to adventurous philosophy, as you say, which is the idea of let's transform into each other. Let's be ready, let's be willing to transform each other. Don't you think this is something that in the history of Western philosophy has been described as a kind of a conversion, and the idea that we change our mind in order to admit, in order to receive something external? I don't mean just St. Paul. I think of the myth of the cave in Plato, those idiots who refuse to convert themselves to something new. Okay, and this idea of this kind of plastic force isn't it also what has been described in terms of generosity, of charity in Western philosophy, or in Greek, think with the megalopsychia, no? The la grandeur d'âme, the soul that is able to include something bigger than itself. So don't you think that Western philosophy in its history has the tools to go into this direction, even if in modern and contemporary philosophy, these tools have been a little bit set aside? But the idea of civilization, of Bildung, of paideia, is exactly what I thought you describe as self-transformation, as being able to go adventurous and change yourself.
I agree. No, these are ideas that are in the nucleus, at the center of Western philosophy and civilization. However, the way in which they were put in practice in Latin America, it was different, you see, because I think the way in which the encounter between European culture and American culture during colonization in the 16th century produced a certain way of thinking, a philosophy, an original Latin American philosophy, which stressed those points in a very important manner. No? So I would say that yes, those ideas are European, but I think that in America, no? In the American continent, they have been sort of developed in a particular manner. Thank you.
Can I add one thing, observation? If first, when we talk one school of philosophy, we build the boundary. There's Asian, Chinese philosophy, Latin American philosophy, African philosophy, Western philosophy. But then for the Greek philosophy, do you think Greek philosophy is only Greek philosophy? It's not has become a world philosophy. It's you know, in China, everywhere, students study it as a philosophy, not particularly as you know, the Western philosophy. And then, as Bob mentioned, the 50 now, since Western philosophy, or so-called Western philosophy, has the advantage in many ways, and in 50 years after, and since changes, because the philosophy, one philosophy or many philosophies have been enriched by different traditions. And
sure.
then,
Yeah, well, I'm not sure that Greek philosophy is not Greek philosophy. I mean, it's just universal philosophy. I think Greek philosophy is still Greek philosophy, huh? And of course, I mean, it's a very rich and interesting philosophy. We all learn from there. No? It's central for Western philosophical tradition, but that doesn't make it any less Greek than what it is. But anyway.
Anyway, thank you so much, Professor Pérez. And I think we have to move on because the time is running out. We still have one more question. Thank you, everybody. So let's move on to our next speaker, who's our last speaker, Professor Karim Douglas Crow. I'm so sorry for all these technical difficulties. Okay, so I feel sad to have missed our next speaker, Dr. Umedi Chiang, on the program. Just today, we received a mail from him telling that he is suffering from flu or COVID with serious symptoms. Hence, he is not able to present his paper. And we are happy and thankful to Professor Karim Crow Senior Research Fellow at the McLean Center for Study of Culture and Values, Catholic University of America, a deep Muslim scholar who has agreed to speak on unbinding boundaries and expanding philosophic tasks, drawing our attention to some other very important dimensions. From 2008 to 2016, he was Principal Fellow in the Policy Research at the International Institute of Advanced Islamic Studies, IAIS, Malaysia. He taught Islamic thought at the S. Rajaratnam School of International Studies, Singapore, the International Institute of Islamic Thought and Civilization, Kuala Lumpur, as well as Columbia University, New York City, and the University of Virginia. Professor Crow publishes on Islamic reason and ethics, the Sunni Syria Shiism, metaphysics, and modernity. In fact, it was Dr. Karim Crow who asked about the description from the FISP, but unfortunately, there's no thematic description at the FISP website till now, as Professor Luca has already pointed out that they will be putting the thematic description very soon. So may I invite Dr. Karim Crow to present his views on the theme. Thank you. Professor Crow.
Thank you, Mukherjee. Bismillah ar-Rahman ar-Rahim. In God's name, blessed and exalted. I'm very honored to have this chance to share with you some reflections, although coming after Professor Pérez's remarkable intervention, I feel a little trepidation. Unbinding boundaries. In a sense, going beyond means a dissolution or loosening of the limits and the borders, which would imply bringing what was marginal on the edge or the periphery more into the center so that it becomes part of the common discourse. And this, in a way, is the task that philosophical reflection is seeking to undertake when it looks at boundaries. There are inherited limits we are given from the start, which hinder or serve as obstacles, or at the very least as filters, which let through some things but reject others. And that these inherited limits or boundaries are often unconscious, and they color our worldview. Although I think Professor Robert was correct in saying that the last 30 or 40 years have seen remarkable changes in this condition, partly due to globalization and the spread of Euro-American culture around the world. So boundaries are being effaced or erased. COVID. Everyone is in the same boat. Can't avoid. We're all the same in that respect. Ecological disaster threatening our planetary existence. Well, we don't single anyone out. We're all under the shadow of this disaster. And so we have to remember that our conditions today are quite elastic and much more flexible and open to changes than in the past. These obstacles or barriers which hinder us in achieving a more inclusive and expanded view of cultures and of our own selves are both intellectual and cultural and ethical and spiritual, but they also involve economic and political and military aspects, as several of the participants have noted. Therefore, the old boundaries have not all disappeared. Racism, gender inequality, secularity is a new, so to speak, boundary that has been erected in the place of former limits. These are all realities of our hypermodernity. And there are also cognitive barriers or filters of a global nature that are relatively recent historically. These are new borders that are being imposed of a global nature. I'll mention a few. Physicalism or scientism. Again, the question of is European science universal? Quantification, hallmark of modernity. Marketization, the consumerization of human transactions. This is something relatively new and devastating consequences for society. And ultimately, of course, the overwhelming technological advances and digital dominion that has now consumed us, the tyranny of the algorithm, or as Professor Hans Poser of Germany, the Leibniz Society calls it, technodicy. There is no longer a theodicy, a question of absolving God of responsibility for evil and suffering. But since we have become the creators of this technology, it becomes our own responsibility, which is technodicy. And everyone is beginning to understand the abuses of this type of technology has profound consequences on societies. These are all worthy of philosophic reflection, which would imply, as Professor Neville stated in the beginning of our conversation, a new concern for fresh boundaries or expanded borders, a going beyond what we were inherited, born with innately, and achieving a much more inclusive and diverse sense of being. Now, these raise profound questions about the scope of philosophical activity, as Professor Neville has stated. Will this new situation, this mestizo civilization, or should we use the plural, will this enable a more adequate understanding of philosophical tasks and efforts? I mean by adequate, the capacity to confront forces which are shaping our futures and to nourish truly human needs and functions and values. I don't think the question of adequacy is given enough attention in the discussions of the nature we are having now. Some proposed avenues for progress or advancement may not be adequate enough or may be impractical. We have to also accept these forms of limits. So in my view, part of the answer would have to come back to a re-evaluation, a reassessment, or a new understanding of rationality. And rationality beyond instrumentalism of the Enlightenment kind, which has now become the default mode of thinking globally, especially since the peripheral societies were brought into the light of our present situation through the aegis of European powers. And beyond rationality or a re-evaluation and a new appreciation of what can be called reason, which would involve both emotional and instinctive organic aspects of the human beyond simply mental, more than the brain, but the heart incorporated. These are old ideas, Greek nous and Arabic aql and Indian and Chinese concepts of wisdom are all part of this legacy which has been eclipsed by the Enlightenment. And beyond rationality, I would suggest a fundamental significance is a deeper grasp of anthropology, of who we are as creatures, beings, entities, both individually and in communal existence, and of nature, of which we are an integral part. We cannot separate the human from the natural environment, as we're learning to our great regret now. And this would help recreate or resuscitate, or perhaps go forward into a new vision of a metaphysic. Yes, that's a dirty word after Kant, but I think it's something to do with what Professor Neville meant by ultimacy, which I'm not sure I understood him on that. A metaphysic that can sustain our intellectual and our ethical and our spiritual lives. So, to my mind, this is part of what going beyond boundaries involves. And I think that Professor Pérez's insight that a new combination or integration of world forces would not be a miscegenation, but would be a new being for ourselves and for our communal existence. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Professor Ko. May I invite some comments and questions?
May I set a question? Pose a question?
Yes, please go ahead.
It's okay.
Go ahead.
Go ahead.
May I speak? Thank you. Thank you for your very interesting report. I'm delighted with your conclusion and with your development of your story about globalization of culture and globalization of philosophy. And my question, not a question, but some kind of problem arises in my mind that we can consider these technological points, technological new discoveries as achievements of human mind, achievements of our mind, development of our mind, including computer and all many other technological things. And these achievements depend on the artificial environment which we made and which we develop according to our interests, according to our impulses and our intentions. this development also has negative side. That is the ecological problems, ecological catastrophe. So can we find some balance between the positive and negative points of this process, achievements of our mind thanks to development of environment, and at the same time, these negative points, problems of ecology, which accompanies our progress. Thank you. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Mamuka. I'll try to answer briefly. I hope so. But as Professor Peimin reminded us, if you look more objectively at human responses and strategies, you have the distinct impression of immaturity and naivety, and also of entrenched interests, selfish interests that don't try to work for the common good, but are solely devoted to their own wealth and power. And these are serious obstacles. Technology has allowed select minuscule group of individuals and corporations to basically achieve a kind of dominance that was inconceivable before technology. And humans haven't yet figured out a way to protect themselves from the downside of technology. No one wants to go back to pre-electricity days, or even now pre-computer days. But in order for us to have a meaningful and enriching common life, we have to grow up a lot concerning how we use the technology. I don't have any simple answers, but I would hope that governments and societies would allow the wisest among them to guide us on these issues, not simply the most powerful or wealthiest. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you.
Thank you. I think we are running out of time, and I guess we can conclude now if there's no pressing question or pressing comment from the audience. Yeah, okay. So I would like to thank everyone for a great presentation from each and every speaker, bringing in the rich dimensions of the platform and for insightful questions and also comments from the audience. I want to thank all the speakers, each one of them, and also for most of them who have stayed up to the end for being with us. And it is really kind of an enriching experience for all of us. At the end, I would also request most of the people who are present here to continue to think the issues, the complex issues involved on the theme, and make contributions from their own cultures and traditions and philosophies for crossing the boundaries. And I want to thank once again to each one of you. I only wish that we also could include some speaker representing Indian philosophical tradition in this seminar, but maybe some other time we will try to do that. But at the end, gratitude to Dr. Hu Yeping for providing such a great opportunity to all of us. And once again, thank you, everyone. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you for everyone and for your contribution. We hope it can continue our cooperation for future. And have a good Sunday or good week, and take care.
Thank
Yeah.
you.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you, everybody. Thank you.